Putin orders Ibrahim Traoré to move, but his response freezes the world in shock. What happens next will change the course of global power forever. In a high-stakes game of global politics, few moments have ever been as tense as the one that unfolded in a secret meeting room somewhere, deep within the Kremlin. President Vladimir Putin, known for his steely resolve and strategic brilliance, sat at the head of a long, dark mahogany table. His fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the wood, signaling both impatience and determination. Across from him, a screen flickered to life, revealing the image of one of the most powerful military leaders in Africa today, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and enigmatic president of Burkina Faso. Putin's cold gaze never wavered as he issued the order that would alter the course of history. "Ibrahim, I need you to move, now." The words were simple, but their implications were anything but. The world waited, breathless, for Traoré's response, unsure of whether it would be a simple yes or a reply that would echo across the globe. Ibrahim Traoré had always been a man who walked to the beat of his own drum, a leader who had risen from the ashes of Burkina Faso's troubled political landscape. His rise to power was nothing short of meteoric, driven by a combination of military genius, charisma, and an unyielding belief in his country's potential. As a young officer, Traoré had orchestrated multiple successful operations, swiftly taking down insurgents that had once plagued the country. Now, as president, he was faced with a different kind of challenge, one that demanded diplomacy. Strategy and a keen understanding of global power plays remained composed, his expression unreadable. He had known moments like this before, moments where he was asked to choose sides in a world divided. But this felt different. Putin was not a man who made such demands lightly. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed, thinking of the possible consequences. Back in the Kremlin, Putin's voice came again, this time with a more pressing tone. "Ibrahim, this is not a request. It is an order." The intensity in his voice was palpable, almost tangible through the screen. There was no room for hesitation. In Putin's eyes, this was more than a mere transaction. It was a critical move in a larger chess game that would shape the future of global alliances. Yet, as the word settled, a sense of urgency began to creep in. The world, it seemed, was on the verge of a shift. What had initially seemed like an isolated political maneuver now felt like a call to arms. The Russian president was pulling strings, trying to draw Ibrahim into a larger geopolitical conflict that had the potential to unravel fragile alliances across Africa and Europe. But would Ibrahim follow? Would he be a pawn in Putin's grand scheme? Or would he refuse and chart his own course? As Ibrahim sat in silence, the weight of the moment began to settle over him. His mind raced as he thought of the possible consequences. A decision made in this room could ignite political fires across continents. The United States, the European Union, China, all of them were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness or betrayal. Burkina Faso was already under immense pressure from various factions, some supporting Western ideals, others siding with China, and a few even advocating for a more independent stance. Ibrahim had always been a neutral player, seeking only to secure the best interests of his people. But the world wasn't always so forgiving of neutrality. If he rejected Putin's request, would it cost him his newfound position of power? If he accepted, would it jeopardize his country's sovereignty? There was no easy answer, no clear path forward. The stakes had never been higher. Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressing lightly against his temple. He had always been a man of action, a military leader who believed in decisive moves. Yet now, he was faced with a dilemma that could not be solved with force or tactics. This was a matter of personal principle, of the kind of leader he wanted to be. Traoré had spent his entire life fighting for Burkina Faso's independence, both from internal and external forces. His people had suffered enough under foreign influence, whether in the form of colonialism or modern-day intervention. Yet here he was, being asked to make a choice that could either cement his legacy as a nationalist hero or mark him as another puppet in the hands of global superpowers. His heart raced as the silence stretched on. The world waited with bated breath, hoping for a sign, any indication of which path he would choose. After what seemed like an eternity, Ibrahim finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, yet there was an undeniable edge of resolve. "I understand your position, Vladimir, but you must understand mine as well." The words hung in the air, between them like a challenge. Putin's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps it was surprise, perhaps intrigue, no one could say for certain. But in that moment, it became clear that Ibrahim was not simply going to roll over and follow orders. He was not one to be easily controlled. He was a leader in his own right, with his own vision for Africa and its place in the world. As he continued to speak, his words rang out with conviction. "Burkina Faso will chart its own course. I will not be anyone's pawn." Putin remained silent for a moment, his icy gaze never leaving the screen. He had expected resistance, of course, but this was unexpected. Ibrahim's refusal to bend to his will was a reminder of just how unpredictable the game of geopolitics could be. Putin was not a man who tolerated defiance, especially from someone who had the potential to disrupt his carefully laid plans. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that Ibrahim's response was not simply a rejection, it was an opening that could either lead to a dangerous standoff or a new kind of alliance. Putin was a master of negotiation, and he knew that sometimes a refusal was just the beginning of a much deeper conversation. He leaned forward, his voice now calm but sharp. "Very well, Ibrahim. You've made your position clear, but remember the world is watching, and decisions made now will have consequences far beyond your borders." As soon as the conversation ended, the ripple effects of Ibrahim's bold refusal were felt across the globe. News outlets from Africa to Europe to North America were quick to pick up the story. Headlines blared, "Burkina Faso defies Putin. A new era for African leadership." Social media exploded, with people from all walks of life sharing their opinions. Some hailed Ibrahim as a hero, standing up to the Russian bear and asserting Africa's independence. Others feared that his defiance would lead to economic sanctions, or even military intervention from Russia. But what was undeniable was the fact that this moment had shifted the dynamics of global politics. The world had never been so divided. Yet this single act of defiance brought into sharp focus the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the modern geopolitical landscape. Ibrahim knew that his decision would not come without consequences. In the days following his refusal to comply with Putin's demand, he was faced with mounting pressure from both internal and external forces. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to reconsider, warning that a confrontation with Russia could spell disaster for the country's already fragile economy. Others stood by him, arguing that this was the moment to solidify Burkina Faso's independence and to carve out a new role for Africa on the world stage. Ibrahim trusted his instincts and, more importantly, he trusted the will of his people. He had come to power not through manipulation, but through the support of those who believed in a better future for Burkina Faso. This was not just about him, it was about his nation's sovereignty and its ability to stand tall in the face of foreign pressure. Days turned into weeks, and the world waited for the next move. Would Putin retaliate? Would there be economic sanctions, military strikes, or covert operations to undermine Ibrahim's government? The Kremlin, ever the master of subtlety, remained silent, watching the situation unfold. Meanwhile, Western powers took a cautious approach, offering quiet support to Ibrahim but refraining from any overt action. They too were caught in a delicate balancing act, unsure of how far they could push without provoking further instability. Ibrahim's phone rang constantly, filled with messages from allies and foes alike. But he remained steadfast, unwilling to waver in the face of the pressure. His message to the world was clear: Burkina Faso would not be bullied into submission. The coming months would be critical in determining the fate of his nation and perhaps the future of Africa's geopolitical standing. As the weeks passed, Ibrahim's defiance began to yield unexpected results. Countries across Africa, many of which had long struggled under the influence of Western powers or foreign-backed autocrats, began to take notice. Leaders from across the continent reached out to Ibrahim, offering support or seeking to establish new, mutually beneficial partnerships. There was a quiet but growing movement, one that sought to unite Africa in its struggle for greater autonomy and self-determination. Ibrahim's refusal to bow to Putin's demands had sparked a fire of independence that was quickly spreading across the continent. From Dakar to Addis Ababa, leaders were reconsidering their foreign policies, questioning old alliances, and exploring new avenues for economic growth and political cooperation. Putin, watching these developments unfold, began to assess the situation from a different angle. The African continent, rich in resources and strategic positioning, was not something Russia could afford to lose. His initial response to Ibrahim's refusal had been one of pride and calculated anger. But the tides were shifting. As new alliances formed and the international community showed signs of backing Ibrahim, Russia found itself in a precarious position. The Kremlin had always prided itself on being a master of the global chessboard, but now it was being outplayed. Ibrahim's decision had thrown a wrench into Putin's plans, and the consequences of underestimating him were becoming painfully clear. As more African nations aligned themselves with Ibrahim, the balance of power began to shift. International corporations, who had long exploited Africa's resources with little regard for local interests, started to reconsider their investments. China, too, took note of the emerging shift. While its interest in Africa was primarily economic, it recognized the growing unity among African nations and saw an opportunity to further its influence through soft power rather than military intervention. Beijing quickly extended offers of new infrastructure projects, trade deals, and diplomatic support to countries that were increasingly weary of Western influence. These offers, however, came with their own set of strings, attached strings that were far more favorable than what the West had ever proposed, and far more aligned with the priorities of African leaders like Ibrahim. As nations aligned themselves behind Ibrahim's bold stand, the influence of the West began to wane, replaced by a new era of African cooperation. The world's superpowers were slowly being forced to adapt to this new reality, one where Africa was no longer merely a playground for foreign interests, but a continent asserting its own power and voice. As Ibrahim's refusal to bow to Putin resonated across the African continent, it reverberated throughout the international community, challenging long-held perceptions of power and influence. What began as a singular act of defiance against Russia quickly morphed into a broader movement of resistance, one that questioned the legitimacy of old alliances and global dominance. The European Union, which had once viewed Africa as a series of fragmented nations ripe for the picking, began to reconsider its strategy. The U.S., which had long relied on Africa's instability to maintain its geopolitical leverage, found itself in a more complicated position. Both Western powers and Russia were now being forced to contend with a continent that was no longer willing to play by their rules. This shift was no longer about one man's decision. It was about a global recalibration, one where Africa was no longer relegated to the sidelines of world affairs. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré's response to Putin's demand marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Burkina Faso and Africa as a whole. His refusal to be intimidated, to be pushed into submission, had proven that strength does not always lie in the might of armies or the wealth of nations, but in the courage of leaders willing to make hard choices for the future of their people. The world was now looking at Burkina Faso in a new light, not as a small, impoverished country, but as a beacon of resistance, of independence, and of the potential for true sovereignty. Ibrahim's legacy would not be defined by his ability to navigate the waters of global power politics. It would be defined by his unwavering commitment to his nation and his people. And as the sun set over the land of the brave, it was clear that Africa's voice would no longer be silent. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay up to date with more content like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us as we explore the stories that shape our world.